The cameras never capture the real beginning of history. It happens in rooms where the curtains stay drawn, where the light falls in narrow lines across maps no one else is meant to see. And somewhere in that silence, between the hum of an air conditioner and the click of a pen, a small decision begins to tilt the world. For Africa, that moment arrived not in Beijing, Washington, or Paris, but in a modest room in Ouagadougou. The man sitting at the center of it was 34-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't a politician groomed in Western universities, nor the product of any elite military academy. He was a soldier who had seen too many orders, issued from abroad and too few, answered at home. His rise to power in the autumn of 2022 felt like an echo of forgotten revolutions. The radio crackled with the news of a coup d'etat, and within 48 hours, a young officer had overthrown a system many, Burkina Faso, no longer recognized as their own. "We do not ask for permission to be free," he said, a single line that rippled from dusty villages to crowded capitals. It was defiance but also declaration. What followed was not chaos, but a strange, deliberate calm. French troops packed up and left. Military bases once guarded under foreign flags fell silent. In cafes and market squares, people whispered about the return of dignity, about a captain who spoke like the generation their fathers had waited for. Yet power, Traoré would soon discover, is never truly free. The mines that fed foreign banks remained under foreign control. The currency still obeyed an external will. Every independence in Africa has come with fine print, and he intended to read every word of it. Inside, the presidential palace, now stripped of old portraits and repainted in the red, green, and gold of the new order. A quiet blueprint began to take shape. The goal was audacious, to turn Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation of farmers and miners, into the corridor that would redraw Africa's economic geography, not through rebellion, but through reinvention. He called it the Second Revolution, one fought with roads instead of rifles, fiber optics instead of bullets. To achieve it, he needed a partner strong enough to defy Western pressure, yet pragmatic enough to see profit where others saw poverty. The world assumed he would call Moscow. But the message that left Ouagadougou was addressed to Beijing. That outreach, later known among intelligence circles as Operation Gateway, began under cover of darkness. No headlines, no leaks, only a handful of advisors and a visiting team from China's state-owned CITIC group. They met not in boardrooms but in converted warehouses, surrounded by rolled-up blueprints and coffee-stained maps. The proposition was as simple as it was seismic. Connect the Atlantic to the Red Sea through Burkina Faso. Build a spine of steel and silicon across the Sahel. Make the poorest hard. In exchange, China would pour billions into rails, solar grids, and digital networks, all under the banner of mutual development. When the plan surfaced months later through satellite leaks and intercepted cables, panic spread faster than clarity. French analysts described it as a geopolitical Trojan horse. American think tanks called it the silent phase of a new Cold War. But inside Burkina Faso, people used simpler words: hope, work, future. Across the countryside, cranes rose where cattle once grazed. In villages that had never known streetlights, solar panels began to bloom like metallic flowers. To the west, these were statistics. To locals, they were miracles. Traoré's speeches carried both pride and warning. Political freedom without economic power is half a victory. And for once, the world seemed to listen. From Washington to Paris, the question was no longer who is he, but what does he want? In the Pentagon, analysts traced new Chinese rail corridors on digital maps, overlaying them with military logistics routes. The phrase dual-use infrastructure began circulating in classified memos. In Paris, defense committees met behind closed doors. One diplomat described Burkina Faso as the crack in the wall through which Beijing now sees the Atlantic. News anchors compared Traoré to Nkrumah, Sankara, even Mao, depending on whether they feared or admired him. Yet behind every headline was a simpler truth. A forgotten nation was forcing the world to pay attention. On the ground, the transformation was tangible. Young engineers studied Mandarin instead of French. Farmers used mobile payments to sell directly to urban buyers. University students no longer spoke about emigrating. They talked about building. But progress breeds paranoia. Western consultants warned of debt traps. Opposition figures accused the government of trading sovereignty for cement. When questioned, Traoré's reply was blunt. If building roads is submission, then perhaps freedom is not what they think it is. His words became a refrain, quoted on radio, printed on t-shirts, whispered like a new national prayer. Still, beneath the applause, unease lingered. Intelligence reports hinted at surveillance networks embedded within new data hubs. security chiefs debated whether Chinese technology meant partnership or quiet oversight. And as neighboring nations, Mali, Niger, Chad, began signaling interest in similar deals, the region's old balance began to wobble. Operation Gateway had turned the Sahel into a chessboard where the pieces were railways and fiber cables, instead of troops. But the stakes were no less strategic. By late 2024, satellite images showed a metallic line cutting through red soil from Ouagadougou toward the Gulf of Guinea, a project so vast it seemed to hum even from orbit. Western media dismissed it as overreach. African commentators called it awakening. Somewhere between those interpretations lay the real story. Not of Chinese dominance or Western decline, but of a continent reclaiming its coordinates. Because history rarely belongs to the loudest powers. It bends instead toward those who act while others argue. And in the silence of his palace office, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was acting, guided by the belief that Africa's freedom would never be granted by treaties or aid, but built by its own hands, steel bar by steel bar. The world could call it whatever it wished. He called it destiny. The storm did not arrive with thunder. It came with reports, cables, and a rising unease in the polished corridors of power. In Washington, the mood was one of disbelief turning into quiet alarm. For years, the United States had treated the Sahel as a low-priority zone, a region of humanitarian concern rather than strategic relevance. Yet now, an unfamiliar pattern was emerging on the satellite screens of the Pentagon. Lines of rail gleaming under the sun, power stations rising in the desert, communication towers stretching like digital beacons, all radiating from one unlikely center, Ouagadougou. The analysts who once dismissed Burkina Faso as an afterthought began calling it the hinge. And behind that hinge, they saw China's reflection. At think tanks along Massachusetts Avenue, white papers began circulating with uneasy titles. The New Heartland, China's Quiet Corridor, The Forgotten Front. Inside the Situation Room, a State Department advisor delivered the blunt summary no one wanted to hear. We didn't lose Africa's loyalty. We ignored it. There was silence, followed by a single question from the National Security Advisor. Can we still catch up? But the truth was clear. By the time Washington noticed, the tracks were already laid, the data lines already humming, and the trust already shifting east. In Paris, the reaction was more emotional. France had long seen West Africa as its cultural echo, its post-colonial backyard draped in shared language and debt. But now, television screens showed the red and gold banners of Burkina Faso fluttering beside Chinese cranes. The tricolor, once raised over outposts and consulates, had vanished from view. French columnists wrote with bitterness, asking how a nation they once guided could now welcome Beijing as an equal. A former intelligence officer, speaking off record to Le Monde, said it plainly. We lost them the moment we stopped respecting them. For years, Paris had relied on presence, troops, bases, advisors. Beijing relied on absence. No lectures, no conditions, only contracts. And in that difference, the balance of affection had shifted. Yet, to call this a Chinese victory was to misunderstand the deeper rhythm of the story. Ibrahim Traoré had no desire to replace one master with another. His private correspondences revealed a man both pragmatic and proud, wary of entanglement yet unafraid of ambition. In one letter to his ministers, he wrote, "We will take their machines, not their minds." He knew that partnerships came with shadows, but he also understood that power was never without risk. The question was not whether Burkina Faso would pay a price, but whether it would be the first to name its own terms. And so, the nation moved forward. The Gateway Rail Corridor reached the Atlantic by the start of 2025, linking Ouagadougou to the Ghanaian port of Takoradi. On the day the first freight train departed, thousands lined the tracks. Some wept, others simply stood in awe. It wasn't the arrival of China they celebrated. It was the return of motion. For decades, their economies had stood still, their ambitions reduced to survival. Now, steel wheels carried the sound of possibility. As one farmer told an Al Jazeera correspondent, "We used to sell gold to strangers. Now we sell time, and they come to buy it." But the sound of progress was not harmonious to everyone's ears. In neighboring Niger and Mali, Western-backed media outlets accused Traoré of selling out Africa's soul. Editorials warned that the debt burden could swallow future generations. Yet, those same warnings came from nations still dependent on IMF loans and European subsidies. The irony was not lost on Africans watching from their living rooms. To them, Traoré's experiment felt less like surrender and more like proof that dignity could be engineered. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the mood was measured but satisfied. Chinese strategists saw in Burkina Faso what they had long sought, a gateway not of conquest, but of credibility. Their doctrine, refined since the early days of the Belt and Road, was evolving. It was no longer about ports and pipelines alone. It was about hearts, symbols, trust. A senior official at the Ministry of Commerce called it the diplomacy of usefulness. If the West offered advice, China offered roads. And in the global South, usefulness was the new morality. Still, there were limits even to mutual respect. When Beijing proposed a permanent logistics hub for its military convoys in northern Burkina Faso, Traore refused. He thanked them for their support, then said, "Africa will not host foreign flags again, not even friendly ones." The message was clear. Partnership, not presence. That single refusal was enough to make Western newspapers reconsider their narratives. For months, he had been painted as Beijing's puppet. But now even the Financial Times began to describe him as an independent actor in a bipolar world. The paradox was, becoming poetic, the man, accused of selling Africa, had instead bought it more leverage than it had ever known. In Moscow, the response was mixed. Russia's influence in the Sahel, built on security contracts and private militias, was beginning to look fragile beside China's economic sweep. Commentators on state television downplayed the development, but privately, Kremlin advisors admitted concern. One strategist put it bluntly, "We fight with guns, they fight with fiber." Yet Traore, ever the tactician, refused to alienate them. He welcomed Russian envoys to Ouagadougou, offering cooperation on energy and security, but only as equals. To each power, he extended the same philosophy. "You may walk through our door, but you will not build your own inside it." Across Africa, this defiance resonated. Young leaders from Senegal to the Congo began referencing Traore in their speeches. Student movements quoted him on social media, calling him the engineer of the African century. African musicians, poets, and writers revived the revolutionary language of the 1960s, now threaded with the digital optimism of the 2020s. The phrase "our future in our hands" became not just a slogan, but a soundtrack. And behind that anthem was the quiet rhythm of transformation. Solar panels, lighting villages, fiber cables stitching towns, and a new African confidence pulsing through the wires. But success has a way of attracting its own storms. Western intelligence began to track unusual movements along the trade corridors. Private security contractors appeared near construction zones. In January 2025, an explosion damaged a section of the rail line near the Niger border. The official investigation blamed local insurgents, but whispers in diplomatic circles told another story. Sabotage, orchestrated to slow the project and send a warning. No one claimed responsibility. Yet, a memo leaked from the French Defense Ministry later that month carried the chilling line. Strategic denial may be the only viable countermeasure. The message was unmistakable. What could not be stopped by negotiation might be disrupted by chaos. In response, Traoré doubled his security apparatus. The Burkina army, once dependent on French coordination, now operated with new autonomy, trained by both domestic and neutral foreign advisors. The young president, who had started as a soldier, understood one thing. The next battle for Africa would not be fought on front lines, but on supply lines. His words echoed through the capital. "We will protect what we build, even if the world disapproves." As spring turned to summer, the transformation of Burkina Faso became impossible to ignore. International media no longer framed it as an experiment. They called it a model. Economists noted a surge in domestic investment. Manufacturing zones sprang up near rail hubs powered by hybrid energy grids. Internet penetration doubled. Education programs funded by the government replaced old NGO initiatives. The dependency machine was breaking down, replaced by something new, imperfect, fragile, but theirs. In London, journalists debated whether this was the long foretold African awakening or merely a brief illusion. In Washington, senators demanded to know why. American development agencies had been outpaced by Beijing and nations where they once led. In Paris, the silence was heavier, the loss more personal. But in Ouagadougou, none of that mattered. The capital buzzed with life, construction, and a sense of inevitability. A nation that had been dismissed as the poorest on earth was becoming the one everyone wanted to understand. And yet, in the quiet moments before dawn, Traoré knew what his admirers did not. Every movement in the global order creates its own counterforce. Every light casts a shadow. Somewhere, in offices far from Africa, new strategies were already being drawn. Sanctions disguised as audits, propaganda dressed as concern, partnerships offered with hidden clauses. The young president stared at the map spread before him, tracing the new rail lines with his finger, aware that every connection he built could also be a target. But then he smiled, a soldier's smile, the kind that comes from knowing the risk is the proof of meaning. "This," he whispered to his reflection, "is how freedom begins, not with applause, but with resistance." By the time the sun rose over Ouagadougou in the last months of 2025, the world was no longer pretending that Burkina Faso was a footnote in someone else's story. Something irreversible had happened, something neither Washington nor Beijing had fully anticipated. The more global powers tried to define Traoré, the more he eluded their categories. He was not a proxy, not a populist, not a revolutionary in the old sense. He was something more unsettling, a leader who had made the vocabulary of sovereignty fashionable again. At first, the term gateway state had sounded like a metaphor. Now it was an institution. The Sahel data corridor, built in partnership with Huawei engineers and African universities, became the largest digital hub west of Nairobi. Fiber networks pulsed beneath the dunes, carrying data for banks, hospitals, and universities from Dakar to Djibouti. The Western press warned of surveillance, but on the ground, people called it connection. To the young, it was the first time their voices could travel beyond the horizon without leaving home. A generation that once sought visas now sought bandwidth, and yet, beneath the progress, geopolitics was tightening like a noose. In Brussels, a confidential EU memorandum circulated with a single alarming sentence. The Sahel is no longer a frontier. It is an axis. The document warned that Chinese economic presence was now so embedded that reversing it would destabilize half the continent. In Washington, hearings grew heated. Senators demanded to know whether America had lost Africa. Think tank scholars tried to soften the panic, arguing that influence, not ownership, was the new currency. But behind their composure was resignation. The era of uncontested Western stewardship was over. For Traoré, the pressure was constant but invisible. Letters from ambassadors, calls from presidents, invitations from corporations cloaked in diplomacy, offers of defense pacts, oil deals, digital monitoring partnerships, all framed as cooperation, none without strings. He declined most, accepted few, and redefined every acceptance on his own terms. "We will not kneel for trade," he told his cabinet. "We will negotiate standing up." That phrase made headlines in Nairobi, Cairo, and Johannesburg. But what he didn't say publicly was that the price of dignity was isolation. Old allies withdrew. Aid packages vanished. Even African leaders who admired him feared association. Power, like faith, demands solitude. Meanwhile, the rhythm of the revolution continued. Trains thundered across the savannah. Container ships bearing Chinese and African flags unloaded at the Atlantic ports now connected to Burkina Faso's steel arteries. Solar cities rose on land once dismissed as barren. At night, satellites captured glowing arcs of light stretching across the Sahel, as if an invisible hand were sketching a new constellation across the continent's spine. Western observers saw encroachment. Africans saw evidence. "We built this," one engineer told a BBC reporter, "with the same hands that used to beg. But history, especially new history, never moves without resistance." In February 2026, a coordinated cyber attack struck the Sahel data corridor. Servers went dark, banks froze, and for 48 hours, the heart of the new digital Africa fell silent. The attackers were never identified. Rumors pointed to foreign intelligence units, mercenary hackers, even disaffected insiders. Traoré appeared on national television, his voice calm, his uniform unbuttoned at the collar. "If they fear our connection," he said, "then it means we are finally connected." The next morning, citizens returned to work, and by dusk, the network pulsed again, faster, stronger, more secure. For his people, it wasn't just recovery, it was proof. The storm had passed, and they had survived it. In the aftermath, something extraordinary happened. The African Union, long criticized as a ceremonial body, convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. The agenda was cryptic: sovereign infrastructure and the future of the continental economy. When the doors closed, what unfolded was unprecedented. Ministers from over 30 nations debated openly the idea of a new African connectivity charter, one that would bind digital, transport, and trade networks into a unified continental grid, free from external control. The proposal was radical, but it bore a single signature at its core: Ibrahim Traoré. Delegates who once mocked the young captain now quoted him. "Political freedom without economic power is only half a victory." His phrase echoed through the halls like a commandment. Even the skeptical nations, Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, admitted that his model had produced tangible results. For the first time in decades, Africa was not asking for permission to integrate, it was demanding it. And while the charter would take years to materialize, that meeting marked a turning point. the quiet birth of an idea larger than any one leader. Continental self-definition. From Washington, the White House watched with unease, then curiosity. In a confidential memo later leaked to Foreign Policy, an advisor wrote, "We are witnessing the first genuinely post-Western generation of African leadership. They are not anti-American. They are simply unafraid." In Beijing, the reaction was more calculated. Chinese officials praised the initiative publicly but bristled privately. Traore's refusal to institutionalize military cooperation had set limits even Beijing could not ignore. A senior diplomat was overheard saying, "He learns from us faster than we expect." For China, Burkina Faso had been a project. For Traore, it had become a precedent. Back in Ouagadougou, the young president worked from a modest office filled with maps, models, and a single framed photograph of Thomas Sankara. His aides recalled how, in long midnight meetings, he spoke not of power but of timing. "Empires fall," he said, "not when they are weak, but when they forget why they began." He knew he was walking a line drawn by history itself, between admiration and assassination, between independence and isolation. The threats were real. Intelligence briefings hinted at plots. Western contractors abruptly withdrew. Anonymous warnings circulated, but he pressed on, convinced that legacy required risk. By the close of 2026, the phrase "gateway doctrine" entered global political vocabulary. Universities in Harvard, Oxford, and Pretoria began offering seminars on it. Documentaries traced its origins from the dusty military barracks of 2022 to the steel arteries of 2025. The core idea was disarmingly simple. Small nations could achieve sovereignty not through defiance, but through design, by turning their geography into leverage. Traore had proven that landlocked did not mean powerless. That poverty, when reorganized around purpose, could become strength. In the years that followed, ripple effects spread across the continent. Niger announced a digital free trade corridor with Chad. Ghana and Benin began joint energy projects. Even Ethiopia, once distant from West African politics, endorsed the idea of an African central grid. And in each of these announcements, echoes of Burkina Faso's voice could be heard. The continent was no longer waiting to be developed. It was building itself from within. The West adapted cautiously. The United States launched a new Africa infrastructure partnership, this time emphasizing mutual oversight rather than aid. France, after years of strategic denial, began offering debt relief and cultural partnerships instead of military contracts. Even the IMF altered its tone, acknowledging that African debt restructuring must consider indigenous development frameworks. It was a quiet revolution, one that began not with violence, but with competence. And yet, in the global narrative, the man at the center of it all remained an enigma. To his people, Ibrahim Traoré was the captain who reclaimed their future. To the West, he was the strategist who outplayed the board. To Beijing, he was both partner and proof of concept. But to himself, he was simply a man who refused to accept the inherited definition of smallness. When asked by a journalist whether he saw himself as the father of a new Africa, he replied, "No. I am the son of the one that was always here. We just had to remember its name." That name, Africa, began to mean something different. Not a continent waiting for aid, but a civilization rewriting its coordinates. And in that transformation, the story of Burkina Faso became mythic, a reminder that power can arise from the unlikeliest soil. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the halls of Washington, the world began to grasp a paradox that had long been ignored, that sometimes the smallest nations carry the largest mirrors. As 2027 dawned, a new satellite image captured the heart of the Sahel at night. From above, the desert shimmered like constellations of light, rail lines, solar fields, and data grids forming a glowing lattice across the continent's center. Analysts in London compared it to a digital Nile, a river of electrons feeding the roots of a continent reborn. In that glow, beneath the hum of servers and turbines, the quiet heartbeat of a new world pulsed steadily, defiant, patient, alive. And in a televised address watched from New York to Nairobi, Ibrahim Traoré spoke for less than 5 minutes. He didn't mention China or the West. He spoke of children learning under electric lamps, of workers building bridges without permission, of nations remembering that history is not inherited, it's built. Then, he looked into the camera and said, softly, "We have walked in the dark long enough. It is time to build our own dawn." The screen faded to black, and for a moment, the world, divided, suspicious, and weary, felt the stillness that follows truth. Because the revolution was never in the coup, nor in the contracts. It was in the redefinition of what a nation could mean. Burkina Faso had not opened a door for China. It had opened one for Africa. and through it, the century itself was stepping forward.